Mr. Cooper, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ms. Hogan, you found in your report 186 cases of conflict, 96 cases where declarations of conflict were made, 90 cases where they were not by, in almost all cases, board members. Would you agree that in all of those cases where monies were funneled to companies' board members, and that was in the case of almost all of those conflicts, totaling nearly $319 million, that was in contravention of the Canada Foundation for Sustainable Development Technology Act?
Well, I would tell you that we found that the 90 cases that were not well managed didn't follow their own conflict of interest policies. I think what didn't follow the Sustainable Development Technology Act was how the member council dwindled down to 2, and those 2 members were able to appoint 5 board members. That is where the act was contravened. The rest was around not respecting the contribution agreement.
Well, I would just, through you, Mr. Chair, Section 12 sub 2 of the Act says that directors are not to profit, that no director shall profit or gain any income or acquire any property from the foundation or its activities, and yet $319 million was funneled into the companies in which board members had an interest, and that would seem to me, on the face of reading the Act, to be a violation of the Act.
I think, Mr. Chair, the member highlights an area where we noted in our report that the conflict of interest policy established by the Board of Directors of the Foundation did not comply with its Act. Absolutely, the Act was clear that an individual should not personally benefit, yet their policies were just provided for a blackout period. They were much less restrictive on the board members than they were on the employees of the Foundation.
Precisely. So they had a conflict policy that was inadequate insofar as it didn't necessarily meet up with the law in terms of complying with the law.
With its, yes, you're correct in that instance. Yes.
Thank you for that. Mr. Kennedy, the Auditor General's report is a scathing indictment of, I said, the department that you help oversee as the Deputy Minister. Your department has a duty to oversee $1 billion taxpayers' dollars that was sent to STDC. We now know that taxpayers were ripped off. Nearly $400 million out of $850 million that was spent by STDC was improperly spent. $319 million in cases of conflicts of interest, $59 million in which there was non-compliance with contribution agreements. Canadian taxpayers deserve a refund, and they deserve a refund now. What instructions has the Minister provided you to get taxpayers their money back?
I think, Mr. Chair, we have been working with the organization, partly through the Management Response and Action Plan, to look at all of the organizations that are receiving funding now and to, this is my layperson's language, but effectively kind of rescreen them and kind of put them, back through some sort of process to examine, whether or not there are problems, like whether or not some of the issues identified by the Auditor General, remain present. The organization's actually engaged a third party. They have a third-party audit firm that's helping with that. So we're effectively, to date, and this will be something that the new management team, the new board at STDC
How much of the $400 million of taxpayers' money that was improperly spent is going to be recouped, and when?
I think, Mr. Chair, it is important to keep in mind what we're talking about here, because there are kind of multiple levels of issues that have been, surfaced by the various reviews and audits that have been undertaken. There are going to be cases where potentially funding was provided and it needs to be recovered. There are going to be other cases where organizations, private sector companies, in good faith, engage in a contractual relationship with STDC, presuming that that what they were doing was in accordance with the rules, and may find themselves in a situation where actually...
Well, sir, the Auditor General found that there was $6.2 million, just a small a portion of the $400 million in projects that were canceled by STDC that your department had a responsibility to recover funds from, and your department didn't even do that?
I think, Mr. Chair, on the issue of recoveries, that's a separate issue. We will be taking action to offset funds owed in cases of recoveries. It is absolutely the case that where an organization has not, spent the money, or whether it's been spent improperly, there needs to be a recovery. That money should be returned to the Crown. I would agree entirely with the member on that point.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper, this begins our fourth and final round. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Kennedy, you stated that your department, I said, acted swiftly upon learning of mismanagement at SDTC when it received information from the whistleblower on February 16th, 2023. With the greatest of respect, I say that simply is not sufficient. Your department was responsible for overseeing compliance with the contribution agreements and to ensure that there were not conflicts of interest. And we now know that $400 million taxpayers' dollars improperly went out the door, much of which went to pad the pockets of Liberal insiders who sat on the Green Slush Fund board. So do you accept any responsibility as Deputy Minister for that?
I think, Mr. Chair, I was on record at the beginning of the meeting of agreeing with the findings of the Auditor General's review that...
Do you accept responsibility, yes or no?
I think, Mr. Chair, as I said at the beginning of the meeting, we agree with the Auditor General's report of the necessity of ISA doing additional oversight of the organization, and we have a fairly detailed plan to...
So you don't accept any responsibility, that's what you're saying. So maybe you can help Canadian taxpayers who've been ripped off understand how it is possible that your department never received or requested conflict of interest records from the Green Slush Fund.
I think, Mr. Chair, as I noted at the beginning, we agree with the Auditor General's finding that there needs to be additional oversight done by the department.
No kidding. But how is it possible that your department didn't even ask for any receipts? And maybe while we're at it, maybe you can explain why your department failed to conduct even a single audit to determine SDTC's compliance with the contribution agreements with your department.
Well, Mr. Chair, as I noted at the beginning in my comments, this is an organization that has an unusual status. It isn't even normal.
The Auditor General found, sir, it's very clear, 6.67 of the Auditor General's report sets out the responsibilities that your department has, that I referenced. So the notion that it's arm's length doesn't mean that your department has no responsibility. $1 billion taxpayers' dollars
well, I think,
went
Mr.
to
Chair,
SDTC. So don't tell me that because it's arm's length, that somehow you can gives your department the basis to say, well, it wasn't our fault when you never requested conflict of interest records, when you didn't conduct a single audit, when your department failed to request any information from SDTC about terminated funding agreements. Quite frankly, sir, I would actually ask this question. Can you point to anything your department did right?
I think, Mr. Chair, the Auditor General's report notes a range of activities we did as part of our oversight. Clearly, those were not sufficient to catch the problems at the board level. But I would note that, this is not an organization that even typically would be subject to audit by the Auditor General, unlike, say, my organization that is regularly audited or the NRC that is regularly audited. This is a private sector organization that is far removed from the government. It's not government property. The principal responsibility for enforcing these rules was with the board. Our oversight was not sufficient to catch the fact that the board wasn't fulfilling its duties.
You had an assistant deputy minister sitting in on the meetings, observing conflict after conflict after conflict, and your assistant deputy minister did nothing, and your department did nothing, and there was no direction from the minister that your department do anything. And it is a complete and utter breakdown from the standpoint of a proper oversight, and Canadian taxpayers are out $400 million as a consequence. I want to ask you about the $38 million in unlawful COVID payments that the board approved, millions of which went into their own companies. They didn't recuse themselves. The chair even moved the two motions in which her company was enriched by several $100,000 as a result of those COVID relief payments. The Auditor General's report is very clear that your department was aware at the time that the board approved those payments. Can you explain why your department turned a blind eye to what amounted to a black and white violation of the contribution agreement with respect to $38 million that went out the door?
I think, Mr. Chair, I've already spoken to this issue before. I would simply note that, the reason why this organization is being moved to the NRC
You knew
is
about
because
it.
it's
You knew about
is
it.
because it's very.
You knew about it,
it's
right,
because-
sir? You knew about the $38 million that went out the door unlawfully. in
I think, Mr.
violation-
Chair, I feel like I've already spoken to this
Well,
issue.
I'm asking you.
I'm happy to provide some elaboration.
Mr. Cooper, your time just ended, so why don't I'll give Mr. Kennedy time to respond. You have the floor, sir.
I would simply note, and I think there's been extensive testimony today, that the very design of this organization, which by statute has to have members on the board with deep experience in the clean tech industry, the fact that it is arm's length and is not subject to a lot of the usual checks and balances, that called for additional oversight and scrutiny. We agree
It's like you're washing your hands clean of any accountability. Canadian taxpayers deserve so much better.